In our last session, we focused in on Ahaz, the faithless king, and we were deeply disappointed at his inability to trust in his God and the fact that he led both himself and the kingdom of God into disaster. Now, Ahaz is a bookend of two, and we need to focus on the second bookend in this particular session, and that is Hezekiah, the almost faithful king. So let's get our bearings and take a look at our book chart. As we look at this map, we have thoroughly indoctrinated ourselves on the former versus the latter things. We've seen the introduction that starts with the prophetic lawsuit and that crushing reality of Israel's sin, but ends on a moment of hope. We, in our last session, took a look at Ahaz, the faithless king. This is bookend number one. And this session, we need to take a look at Hezekiah, the almost faithful king, bookend number two. So as we head into Hezekiah's story, let's see what we can do about putting ourselves into real time. So pulling up our timeline, we are very aware of Isaiah's tenure and that he launches his career with King Uzziah and concludes it with King Manasseh. We have also been introduced to the crises that are brought about by the Neo-Assyrian Empire and its assault on the northern and southern kingdoms. At this point, the Syro-Ephraimite wars are past. At this point, 10 years have passed, and the northern kingdom has collapsed as well. And now we are standing in Hezekiah's shoes. At the end of the 8th century, having been voluntarily placed under the oppression of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Hezekiah the righteous is chafing at the bit. He is eager to get out from underneath the yoke of Assyria and set the kingdom of God free. But this will not be as simple a task as he would like it to be, and this leads us into our third crisis, which is Sennacherib's campaign in 701 BC. Where are we in the midst of the book? We're looking at Isaiah chapters 36 through 39, and the subtitle for this section of Isaiah should be Hezekiah versus Sennacherib. Who are you going to put your money on? And of course, we're going to wind up putting our money on Yahweh, and hopefully Hezekiah will as well. Now, chapters 36 through 39 are a little different from the rest of the book. They are clearly historical material. There's a lot of narrative going on in here, but dropped right in the middle is a famous oracle that comes from the prophet Isaiah as he speaks to King Hezekiah, really the same word that he spoke to Ahaz. What is that word? If you will trust me, you will live. If you will put your confidence in the suzerain of the universe, I will defend you. And this time, to our great joy, our king is going to respond with a trembling but emphatic yes. Okay, that is a very important part of this section of Isaiah as we look at the structure of the book. What about the historical question? Well, one of the things I, as a professor and historian, love about this portion of Isaiah is it presents to us the perfect picture of the blending of the biblical discipline and the archaeological discipline. I spend more summers than not in the land of Israel digging through the dirt. This is part of my training as a professional, and one of the most frustrating things about biblical archaeology is that you're dealing with two disciplines, two data sets that in biblical archaeology need to be integrated. And so often what takes place is we have a biblical narrative that is very important to the writers of the text, and they give us a great deal of detail, but we've found absolutely no material evidence to corroborate it. Or the opposite occurs. We have tons of material evidence to speak to a particular event, but the biblical writers decide that's not important enough to make it into the canon. Well, this event, chapters 36 through 39 of the book of Isaiah, are the perfect integration of the two. And so I call this section of Isaiah's book the poster child of biblical archaeology, because we have three different biblical accounts. We've got Isaiah the eyewitness in chapters 36, 37, 38, And we have the pre-exilic history, national history of Israel in 2 Kings 18 and 19, and we have the post-exilic account in 2 Chronicles 32. So 3 different times this story gets told with all sorts of great detail. And then when we turn to the record of the material evidence, we see that we have a treasure trove of archaeological and epigraphic evidence speaking to this same event. So in this particular historical event, Hezekiah versus Sennacherib, we've got all the data we need to compare and contrast and see how our biblical authors were doing as both theologians and historians. So now let's put ourselves into real space. We've seen real time. What about real space? You're looking at a map of the ancient Near East, and in this map you're looking at Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Assyrians, resistance is futile, you shall be assimilated. Where our story actually begins in 705 BC. In 705 BC, Sargon II is out campaigning, conquering the world, as is the wont of all these emperors, and he's killed in battle. And so a battlefield promotion, his son Sennacherib becomes king in his place. And in response, the rest of the Fertile Crescent says, this is our moment. If we all rebel at once, perhaps Sennacherib, the new king, will be so busy in cleaning things up at home that one of us will slip through the net. And so we see a region-wide rebellion. Babylonia, Elam, the western states, and Egypt itself all rebel at the same time in 705 BC. Again, hoping that someone will escape. Well, Sennacherib is a force to be reckoned with, and he says, like any of you are going to get away from me. And so he takes his father's armies and he turns first toward the east. And he goes after Babylonia and Elam, absolutely essential for his own homeland security, because his capital would be extremely vulnerable if he didn't clean up the east first. But as soon as he gets that done, he heads to the west. And his armies arc up over the Fertile Crescent and start heading for our heroes in the west. Now, most of Judah's allies, Hezekiah's allies, are going to see the armies marching, and they're going to say, oh, didn't mean it, just fooling, here's some tribute, take the temple, take my children, here's some cattle, we didn't mean it, go home. And so most of them are going to jump ship. But Judah, under Hezekiah's leadership, is actually going to stand its ground. Now, the king from Nineveh is necessarily going to have to come down the coast first. So he's going to come down the Via Maris, and he's going to wrap up into the hill country. He's going to hit Lachish first, which is a city you may never have heard of, but in 8th, 7th century Israel, this is Israel's second city. It is kind of the Norfolk, Virginia of ancient Israel. It looks like a residential area, but there are soldiers and weapons behind every door. And after he hits Lachish, he will gain access to the highway that brings him up into the hill country and his real target, Jerusalem. So this is our story. First Lachish, then Jerusalem. What are we going to do? Well, Hezekiah is the perfect foil for Ahaz, because rather than saying, talk to the hand, I've got my own plan, as you remember characterized Ahaz's response, Hezekiah seeks out the prophet. And in seeking out the prophet turns to him and says, Hezekiah, Yahweh's got this covered. Yahweh knows what's going on. Yahweh will defend you. And so Hezekiah rebels, and he makes preparations for war. Hezekiah knows that he does not have a snowball's chance in a field encounter against the superpower of the ancient Near East, but he hunkers down for siege warfare. And so he refortifies, he stockpiles food, he takes care of his water sources in all of his principal cities. And we hear this reported in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 1 through 8. It's a lovely synopsis of what Hezekiah does. First, he has to make sure that his capital city has water. So the passage reads, Now when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that he intended to make war on Jerusalem, he decided with his officers and his warriors to cut off the supply of water from the springs which were outside his city, and they helped him. So many people assembled and stopped up all the springs in the stream which flowed through the region, saying, "Why should the kings of Assyria come and find abundant water?" So one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to secure his own water source. Then he's going to refortify his capital city. Then he's going to refortify Lachish, and he's going to stockpile food throughout. This is reported in 2 Chronicles. Sennacherib, however, is marching on the fortified cities of Judah. He's going to hit Lachish first, and the biblical text tells us that he hits Lachish first. Now, it doesn't really detail the war at Lachish because we lose that one, but it gives us great detail when Sennacherib moves from Lachish to Jerusalem. Then, point 3, Hezekiah turns again to the prophet and says, "How do I do this?" And Isaiah says, "Stand firm, Hezekiah. Pour out your heart before me, because your God's got this covered." And Yahweh responds with a promise of victory. Specifically in Isaiah 37, he says, "I'm going to take Sennacherib and I'm going to put a hook in his nose and I'm going to lead him home." What type of animal do you put a hook in their nose? Oh, that would be a huge raging ox. Do you know how the kings of Assyria like to present themselves in their own iconography? Ox, yes. And so Yahweh is going to take care of Sennacherib. Okay, let's take a look then at the material evidence. You're looking at an image right now of Jerusalem. You've probably seen images of Jerusalem 100 times. What you need to realize is that the modern city actually looks pretty different from the ancient city. And although we've got some ancient walls around the modern city, they're not quite ancient enough. So take a look at this model, which is a better reconstruction of ancient Jerusalem. Hezekiah's palace is probably up on the Temple Mount, where Solomon had expanded the city. He's got walls, he's got defenses. His big problem is his water source. As you see in the text, it gets a lot of attention because any ancient city needs water, and any coming army needs water. And Hezekiah's water, unfortunately, is outside this wall. In fact, it's about halfway down the hill. So the first thing he plans to do is to stop it all up so the Assyrians can't find it, and to bring it back inside his own city. And so, absolutely crazy plan. Hezekiah sets up 2 teams of rock cutters, and they start to work from the point at which Hezekiah wants his water to go, inside of his city, from the point at which it actually issues. And 2 teams of engineers work through the night, in the dark, through bedrock, without enough oxygen, carving out the natural caverns underneath the city of Jerusalem, connecting them and grading them with what has been described as the most ambitious engineering project of the Iron Age, which is this period. And they manage to connect these caverns, working from either end, until they meet in the middle and bring the water of ancient Jerusalem's water source inside Hezekiah's city. The tunnel itself is known as Hezekiah's Tunnel today. It was discovered in 1838, but at that time they didn't actually know it was Hezekiah's Tunnel. They knew it was a tunnel, it was really impressive, but who did it belong to? It wasn't until more modern times that they connected this tunnel, which is 1,750 feet long, with this inscription. This inscription is probably the most important inscription coming out of the ancient world, and what you're looking at is a professional script. And the professional has carved into the rock the story of the cutting of this tunnel. Now, it was discovered in 1880, 50 years after the tunnel, by some boys who were actually swimming in the old pool, not having any idea that this was the pool that kept Hezekiah's city alive. And they saw this old tunnel, and they decided to climb up it, because what little boy can resist a cave, right? And as they climbed up into the tunnel, they found this ancient writing on the wall, and one of the boys told his headmaster, who told an archaeologist, and they came back and said, "Oh my gosh, this is an ancient monumental inscription." And originally it had been framed in the wall of the tunnel, and it had introductory lines. And those of us who do epigraphy, which is the examination of ancient inscriptions, would anticipate that the first few lines actually named the king who had commissioned this project, when he did it, and to which god he dedicated it. In other words, I am Hezekiah, and it was in the 18th year of my reign that I commissioned this tunnel in honor of Yahweh. All of that we anticipate would be in this inscription is gone. Because when the young boy told his family, and his family told their family, someone came back and chiseled this inscription out of the tunnel and destroyed those first few lines and the frame that had controlled it. But what text that we actually have now is enough to tell us the story. What you're looking at here is pre-exilic Hebrew script, so ancient stuff, but it tells the story of the tunneling through. And how does it read? This is the account of the tunneling through. All the introductory material is gone, but here we go. This was the manner of the tunneling through. While the coring axe, each one to its companion, and while there remained 3 cubits to be cut through, damaged text, the voice of a man called to his fellow, for there was a fissure, a split in the rock from south to north. So at the moment that the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed, each man toward his fellow, axe against axe. And then the water flowed from the spring to the reservoir for 200,000 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock over the head of the quarrymen. Why is this different and exciting? Well, I can tell you, of all the monumental inscriptions I have ever read, and there are probably hundreds at this point, I have never heard an account that celebrated the workmen. Only the king. Why does this celebrate the workmen? Because partly I think this is volunteer labor. And every man on those teams knows that if we don't succeed, the Assyrians are coming. And not only are we going to die, but our children are going to be dragged off into slavery. We have got to do this. And so at the moment when the tunnels connect, you can feel the passion of the workers. We did it! We did it! We're going to live! Okay, so that's the water source. What about fortifying Jerusalem? Well, in the Jewish quarter of the Old City, back in 1967 through 1969, a certain Israeli archaeologist said, you know what? Hezekiah said he built a tunnel, and we found the tunnel. Hezekiah also said that he built a wall. I'm going to go look for that wall. And so after the 1967 wars in Israel, the area was torn apart anyway, and so the archaeologists went in. And what they found, as you can see on the chart on the screen, is Hezekiah's wall. Because you see, Hezekiah inherited the city that's outlined in red and purple. He inherited David's city and Solomon's expansion. But he also inherited a whole bunch of refugees from the collapse of the northern kingdom, and the population of Jerusalem quadrupled during his reign. That whole western suburb that you see outlined in green, that whole western suburb was completely vulnerable. There was no wall. And so Hezekiah went back and he built a wall. As the text declares, so too Nachman Avagad discovered what we call the Broad Wall. And as you look at this image, you can see a human being standing in the midst of the Broad Wall, so you know why it's called the Broad Wall. It's 23 feet thick. Not only is it really thick, it's really ugly. Like, that is a really ugly wall. And what's ugly about it is that it's haphazard. You see, the frame of the wall clearly was designed by engineers, but the inside, I look at that and I see every man, woman, and child in Jerusalem out in the fields. If you can carry a rock, you get a rock and you bring it back. We got 4 years and the Assyrians are coming. And if we don't have a solid wall that will resist an Assyrian battering ram, every one of us is going to die. So the Broad Wall is this other piece to the puzzle. Yes, indeed, Hezekiah did fortify his city, and this contemporary shot of the wall, I took that just a few summers ago, proves it. All right, what about stockpiling food? Well, there are these really interesting jars that are called lamellic jars. They're called lamellic jars because they're stamped with an imprint from the federal government of Judah. And the imprint says that these jars belong to the king. What did the jars hold? Foodstuffs, oil, wine, grain. Why were they holding oil, wine, and grain? Because we're rationing sugar, butter, and nylons. This is the World War II image of making sure that we've got enough food in our cities to resist the siege to come. Well, they've actually done a clay neutron analysis on these jars, and they've determined that the jars themselves were made in the same workshop, a federal program. And each one of them is stamped. And the stamps are one of two kinds, either this winged sun disk or this scarab, and each one across the top says, belonging to the king, don't you touch it. This is for the siege. And beneath it tells the name of the city from which the stockpiles came. Where do we find these jars? Well, we find a whole bunch of them in Lachish, because Lachish came down. And so they were shattered in Lachish, and then we find them scattered throughout the Judean cities that didn't come down because they lived to tell a story of another day. What about Lachish? Well, as we saw, the Assyrian monarch is going to have to come and wrap up the coast. And so he's going to hit Lachish first. You're looking at, right now, the tell of Lachish. It's enormous. I took this picture back in the 1990s. The reconstruction of this site demonstrates that the city in its heyday, at the end of the 8th century, looked just like this. It had two walls, an inner wall that dated from the 9th, 10th century, an outer wall designed to resist an Assyrian battering ram. It had two gates, and it had a capital fortress administrative center that basically was Fort Knox. This is a city that has residents, but it's a city that has a lot of soldiers. It is the second city designed to keep anyone from coming up into the hills of Jerusalem. Well, Assyria is going to take out Lachish, and the material record is very clear on that. Lachish comes down. And the biblical record tells us about Lachish, but it doesn't detail it because, we lost. In this reconstruction of the city, though, we get an image of what the city should have looked like. And as we go back to Nineveh, which was Sennacherib's capital, we find out that Sennacherib was so impressed with what he did at Lachish that he actually had it drawn up by his artists. He didn't have a photographer, but he did have an artist, and he made the artist bring the sketches home. What does he do with the sketches? Well, he turns them into carved images on marble orthostats. Think paneling. Think marble paneling. You carve it, and then you slap it up on the wall to decorate your audience chamber, to make sure that everyone who comes to visit you gets to see images of you taking out your enemies. Take a look at this particular image. These are drawings of these marble orthostats. They're now housed in the British Museum in London in the Assyria Room. You can go see them. You can't touch them, but you can take pictures. And as we look at these images, we see a synchronic presentation of the battle at Lachish. And lo and behold, we have a double wall. We have an administrative fort in the center. We have a siege ramp. We have battering rams. We have a pictorial presentation of what we found in the ground at Lachish by Sennacherib himself. Okay, so if that doesn't do it for you, if these images of collapse and victory in Lachish don't quite convince you that we have an overlap between material culture and the story told to us in Isaiah, well, let's come to one of the vignettes out of these marble orthostats. Because what you're looking at right here is an image that Sennacherib had drawn of himself on his portable Nemedu throne. You got to travel with your own throne, rock stars, they need to bring it with them. And here are his servants bringing to him tribute while two poor schmoes in the back keep him cool because it can get hot in Judah in the summertime. Well, do you see the inscription over the servant's head? Do you see the cuneiform right here? Well, that cuneiform has been translated, and what it says specifically is Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, sitting on his Nemedu throne, while the spoil from the city of Lachish passed before him. So yes, these drawings are Lachish, and this is the story of Isaiah. Okay, well, if that doesn't do it for you, I got one more, and that is the Taylor prison. Because you see, it's not just the biblical writers who told this story. The Assyrians told the story as well. And Sennacherib, in particular, wrote up his response to this great rebellion because he's very impressive. And as he wrote up this response, one of the copies of it is on this clay prism, also inscribed in cuneiform. And in column 1 and 2, he tells the story of Babylonia and Elam. And in column 3, he turns to his western campaign. He goes into a lot of detail about Lachish because, of course, he was brilliant and had really good hair at Lachish. And then he talks about Jerusalem. As for Hezekiah the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities. By the way, has anyone ever told you that your Bible is complete fiction? Here is an Assyrian king naming Hezekiah. So I went after his smaller towns and walled cities, which were without number. He himself I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. He, Hezekiah, was overwhelmed by the awesome splendor of my lordship. Do you actually think that if an Assyrian king had taken out Jerusalem, he would fail to say so? Do you actually think if an Assyrian king had busted through the wall of Jerusalem, he wouldn't have recorded it here? Of course he would have, but he can't, because just as Isaiah promised, in the middle of the night, for some reason, Sennacherib decides that he needs to go home. And so he turns around, this mighty king, and he leaves Jerusalem unscathed, just as Isaiah 37 and 38 predicted. Oh my goodness. And so as we look at this image of this Assyrian king and we think, who is he and what did he do? We think in terms of Judah's perspective on this. They have been delivered from the superpower of the ancient Near East. They have been delivered from a king who calls himself the prayerful shepherd, the king of Assyria, the king of the four quarters, a king who knew no rivals. And yet this king turns around and goes home, just as Hezekiah believed because Isaiah predicted. Not only is this an amazing story of Bible and archaeology coming together, it is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament of a king who dared to believe and as a result received the blessing of his God. So we close down this particular lesson by asking the question, how does King Hezekiah compare with King Ahaz? We saw that Ahaz failed to believe, right? Talk to the hand. And we see that Hezekiah sought out the prophet and called upon God and said, I'm terrified. I'm in really deep doo-doo here and I need help. And Isaiah speaks for Yahweh and says, I will help if you will believe. And so Isaiah 37 verses 33 through 38 say, as Yahweh says, therefore thus says Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to the city or shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp. By the way that he came, by the same way he will return. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake. Why does Sennacherib go home? Well, most of the historians anticipate that there was some sort of rebellion going on at home. And Sennacherib's been on the road for 4 years now. And this little provincial capital in the hill country of Judea just isn't worth it. Okay, maybe that's why Sennacherib went home. I don't care why Sennacherib home. He left Jerusalem unscathed. And so we come to the end of this presentation and this lesson. And as we do, we hear this final passage coming out of Isaiah itself. Hezekiah, the faithful king, and now, O Yahweh our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all of the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Yahweh, you are God. This is Hezekiah's faith. This is the message of this section of Isaiah. This is our final bookend that leaves us at the end of the former things with a hint of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, unique and unusual faith can lead us to a unique and unusual future.